How do so many people get to be so evil?
It's human nature. We're selfish.
You was right all along.
7 years. 3 seasons. And when the moment finally came to say goodbye, Euphoria didn't just stumble, it quietly walked out of its own story. No grand farewell. No emotional payoff that matched the weight of everything we'd invested in these characters. Just a finale that felt like it belonged to a completely different show. And I think that's actually the most heartbreaking thing about it. Because Euphoria at its best was one of the most visually stunning, emotionally devastating, culturally defining pieces of television we have ever seen. It built a world that felt raw and real and painful in a way that genuinely got under your skin. So when the ending came and it felt cold and detached and almost unrecognizable, the disappointment wasn't just about bad writing. It was about losing something that once felt extraordinary. And in this video, I want to break down exactly why Euphoria failed its ending, what went wrong, and why a show this bold deserved so much better than what it got. There is something deeply frustrating about sitting down to watch the finale of a show you have followed for years and realizing about 20 minutes in that the characters you came for are barely there. That is exactly what happened with Euphoria's final episode. And I don't think people are being dramatic when they say it. I think they are being completely honest. Because when you strip it all back, the finale of Euphoria was not really a Euphoria episode. It was something else entirely. Something that had its own cinematic ambition, its own pacing, its own emotional focus, but it just wasn't the show we had been watching. And that disconnect is really where the problem starts. For 7 years, this show belonged to Rue. It belonged to Jules, to Maddie, to Cassie, to Lexi. These were the people we cried over, argued about, defended, and watched fall apart in ways that genuinely hurt to witness. The whole emotional architecture of the show was built on those characters and the complicated, messy, painful relationships between them. So for the finale to essentially sideline most of them and hand the majority of the screen time over to Ollie, a character who, as much as I respect the performance, barely appeared in this final season, felt like a fundamental misreading of what the audience needed from a closing chapter. And I want to be fair here because Colman Domingo's performance in that finale was genuinely extraordinary. The monologue he delivered about addiction, about fentanyl, about watching too many people die to keep going the way he was, that was powerful television. That was the kind of moment that deserved to exist. But it deserved to exist within a finale that was also giving us everything else we needed, not instead of it. The problem was never Ali's scenes on their own. The problem was the proportion. The problem was that a character who showed up in episode 1 for a brief moment, appeared in episode 7, and then suddenly dominated the entire finale felt like a structural imbalance that the show never really recovered from within those final 80 or so minutes. What made it worse was how little the other characters seemed to feel Rue's death. And that is something I genuinely cannot get past. Rue dying quietly on that sofa was a beautifully handled scene. The way it was shot, the way the day blurred into her seeing her life flash before her, the Bible playing softly in the background, taking her mother's hand as if she was being guided somewhere else, all of that was moving and I mean that sincerely. But the aftermath of it felt almost emotionally empty in terms of how the other characters responded. The people who had known Rue for years, who had been woven into her life in deeply personal ways, barely reacted. There was no real weight given to the fact that she was gone. Jules was the only one who seemed to carry any visible grief and even that felt contained given everything they had been through together. Maddie and Cassie had just lost Nate. They also got the news that Rue had died. These are two people who were central to this entire show, who had histories with Rue that mattered, who deserved a moment to actually process what was happening around them. Instead, they were pushed further and further to the edges of the episode until they almost felt like background characters in their own story. That is not a small creative choice. That is a significant failure in understanding what this finale needed to do emotionally. The show had spent years earning the right to make us feel something about these characters. And then in the final hour, it chose not to spend that currency in the way we needed it to. The argument I keep seeing is that the finale was never meant to be a traditional goodbye, that it was structured as a season finale rather than a series finale intentionally, and that maybe that framing should change how we judge it. And I understand that argument on a surface level. But it doesn't really hold up when you watch the episode itself. Because regardless of how it was marketed or how HBO chose to frame it, what we were watching was the last time we would ever spend time with these characters. And the way those final scenes were distributed and the way so much of the emotional real estate was given to a character who wasn't consistently present throughout the season, That is a creative decision that shaped the experience of watching it. And for a lot of people, that experience felt incomplete. Euphoria had always been a show about the chaos and the beauty and the tragedy of being young and broken and still somehow searching for something to hold on to. That is what it was. That is the identity it built over years of television that genuinely pushed boundaries. And the finale didn't quite honor that identity. It traded it in for something that felt more like a standalone feature film with Western undertones, and in doing so, it left the actual heart of the show feeling underserved. The characters who made Euphoria what it was deserved a proper goodbye. And I just don't think they got one. There is a particular kind of frustration that comes when a show builds towards a major plot moment and then doesn't give you a reason to believe it. Not just a weak reason. No reason at all. And that is exactly what happened with Bishop's betrayal of Alamo in the finale. It was a moment that the entire endgame of the season hinged on. The Western showdown, the symbolism around snakes, the idea that nobody in that world could ever truly be trusted, all of it depended on Bishop switching sides feeling earned and inevitable. And it just didn't. It felt rushed, it felt unclear, and depending on which interpretation you believe, it felt completely out of character for someone we had watched be fiercely loyal for the entire run of the show. Let me explain what I mean. When I first watched the finale and Bishop made his move against Alamo, my immediate reading was that it was survival instinct. That Bishop had watched Alamo's operation slowly deteriorate, had seen more and more of his men disappear, and had made a cold calculation that he was probably next. That reading at least made internal sense for the character. It fit with the idea that in that world, loyalty only stretches so far before self-preservation takes over. I could accept that. It wasn't the most emotionally complex motivation, but it tracked with the environment these characters were operating in and the kind of ruthless logic that world runs on. But then I started seeing the other interpretation. The one that a significant portion of the audience landed on after watching the episode. The idea that Bishop betrayed Alamo because he had developed feelings for Maddie. That a few conversations, a handful of interactions, were enough to make a man who had stood beside Alamo for years decide to turn on him entirely. And if that is genuinely what the show intended, then I think it is one of the weakest and most disappointing character motivations the series ever produced. Because it doesn't just feel thin. It feels like it contradicts almost everything we understood about who Bishop was. Think about the version of Bishop we had been watching. This was not a man who wore his emotions on the surface. This was not someone who made impulsive decisions based on fleeting personal connections. He was disciplined, he was measured, and his loyalty to Alamo was one of the few consistent character traits the show established for him early on. So for the finale to ask us to believe that a few conversations with Maddie were enough to unravel years of that loyalty, that is a significant ask. And the show never really did the work to make that ask feel reasonable. There were no scenes building a genuine emotional connection between Bishop and Maddie that would have made his motivation feel real. There was no slow burn of him questioning his place in Alamo's world because of her. It was just suddenly there in the finale and we were expected to accept it, and here is the thing that really bothers me about it. If Bishop had feelings for Maddie, if that connection was strong enough to make him do what he did, then why was this the first time in his entire life that something like that had moved him to action? Are we really supposed to believe that in all the years he spent in that world, surrounded by everything that lifestyle brings with it, Maddie was the first person to ever make him question anything? That strains credibility. It strains it quite a lot. Because the show never gave us any sense that Bishop was someone who had been waiting for a reason to get out or someone whose loyalty to Alamo was already quietly crumbling before Maddie entered the picture. He just seemed completely committed right up until the moment he wasn't. The betrayal needed to happen. I understand that from a storytelling perspective. The snake symbolism that ran through the entire season needed a payoff. The idea that Alamo's greatest threat would come from inside his own circle was thematically appropriate, and I think with the right execution it could have been genuinely devastating. But the execution required clarity. It required the show to commit to one coherent motivation and then build towards it in a way that made the audience feel the weight of that moment when it finally arrived. Instead, what we got was ambiguity that didn't feel intentional or layered. It just felt unresolved. And there is a meaningful difference between leaving something open to interpretation because the ambiguity serves the story and leaving something vague because the writing didn't fully nail down what it was trying to say. What I would have wanted is for Bishop's turn to be rooted in something that had been quietly developing all season. Whether that was a growing disillusionment with Alamo's leadership, a specific incident that pushed him over the edge, or even a moment of genuine moral reckoning, any of those would have landed harder than what we got. Because then when he made his move in the finale, it wouldn't have felt like a plot device. It would have felt like the conclusion of a human story. And that is ultimately what Euphoria was always best at. Taking characters who existed in extreme circumstances and making their choices feel deeply, painfully human. Bishop's betrayal deserved that same treatment. Instead, it got left in a space that was neither fully explained nor emotionally satisfying. And that is a significant missed opportunity in the final chapter of a show that once handled complexity so well. I want to be careful here because I am not saying that Rue's death was handled badly in terms of execution. The actual scene itself, the way it was filmed, the way the show blended her final moments with flashes of her life, the Bible playing softly in the background, her taking her mother's hand as if something gentle was guiding her out of this world, all of that was genuinely beautiful. It was quiet and it was tender, and in isolation it might be one of the most visually poetic death scenes that this show ever produced. So when I say Rue deserved a different death, I am not talking about the craft of that moment. I am talking about the narrative position of it. Where it happened in the episode, what came before it, what came after it, and whether the show gave her death the structural weight that 7 years of storytelling had earned, because here is my problem. Rue died and then the show kept moving. Not in a way that felt intentional, not in a way that suggested the world continuing on was making some kind of point about grief or about how life doesn't pause for loss. It just kept moving. The other characters absorbed the information, and then the episode carried on with its Western showdown and its Ollie monologues and its Alamo confrontation, and Rue's death became almost a backdrop to everything else rather than the emotional centerpiece it should have been. And for a character who had been the beating heart of this show from the very first episode, that felt genuinely wrong. Rue's death came too early in the finale. That is the most direct way I can put it. If you are going to kill your central character, the person whose voice has narrated this entire story, the person whose addiction and pain and desperate search for something real has been the emotional through line of the whole show, then that death needs to happen at a point in the episode where the narrative can actually stop and breathe around it. Where the other characters have space to feel it. Where the audience has space to feel it. Instead, it arrived and then was almost immediately overtaken by everything else happening in the plot. And that pacing decision undermined the emotional impact of something that should have been absolutely gutting. I also think the show missed a genuinely interesting opportunity by choosing death as Rue's conclusion at all. Because for most of this final season, we heard Rue narrating over the episodes in a way that had a very specific quality to it. It felt like she was recounting things from a distance. Like she was looking back on a specific period of her life from somewhere else entirely. And I kept thinking throughout the season that the narration had the texture of someone speaking from a cell, or from a room where they had been given time and silence to finally process everything that happened to them. It felt like the voice of someone who had survived something terrible and was now sitting with the wreckage of it. The idea of Rue ending up in prison rather than dying actually makes a lot of narrative sense to me when I think about it seriously. Not as a happy ending, because it absolutely wouldn't be. Prison is not freedom. Prison is not redemption in any clean or comfortable sense. But it would be a different kind of consequence. One that carries its own weight and its own painful symbolism. Because the price of everything Rue did throughout this show, the lying, the manipulation, the choices she made when she was at her lowest, that price was always going to be enormous. Death is one way to pay it.